I guess first and foremost, Jennifer, I just want to thank you for making the time to join us for a chat today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited.
Yeah, we are excited to chat because I think what you've done that is particularly exciting, and I think something that a lot of folks, certainly in Compound, are thinking about is like, how do I actually align a lot of my writing with my career ambitions, with some of the change that I want to see happen in the world? But what I wanted to do is give you as much time as you'd like to share a little bit about your background and what you've been up to these past few years.
Yeah, I can do a kind of like a quick bio, just give an overview. I sometimes struggle, like, what do I call myself? But I think generally I'm a startup advisor. I'm a diversity and inclusion strategist. I'm a consultant to startups. And I work on all things kind of people related, organization related for emerging startups and leaders. Most recently, the last full-time job I had was head of people at a startup called Lever, which many of you may have heard of, where used to apply for jobs or hire. And that's really where I got my start in accidentally writing and really finding resonance and a lot of really audience feedback and realizing there's a lot of potential in what I could share and how I can build community and teach with what I was doing. So since then, in the last few years, I've been experimenting a lot in different formats, but really writing has been at the core of it, whether it's writing on diversity and inclusion advice blog, advice column for startups. I've been doing a lot of tweeting. I've helped create, courses and books. So I'm really excited to share a lot of the lessons learned because it's something that no one taught me how to do. I definitely learned a lot from watching others as well, but I've learned a lot of lessons and I'm super excited to share.
I know. And this just as a sneak preview, I love the breadth of the projects that you've done because you contributed to one of the big kind of Holloway books on hiring. You have had a kind of weekly column on Medium. You've done, like you just said, a course. You obviously are very active on Twitter. So I love that you've like covered the landscape of most of the different mediums that people are considering, investing in. And yes, any hard-won wisdom that can save people the hard lesson of learning something themselves will be welcomed. But I really wanted to start at the foundation of kind of what you're up to with your work. And you're very, I think, on message and really like on mission with a lot of these projects, which I really love to see. And so I guess I'm just really curious to hear from you. I think you mentioned hiring, diversity and inclusion, and kind of tech culture broadly are three areas you spend a lot of time on. But I'm curious just to hear from you maybe the things and the change that you really want to help bring about in your consulting and in your writing.
Yeah, I think for me personally, I fundamentally just really love helping people and I love solving problems. I think at a core, like all humans, we have that embedded into ourselves and some of us feel it more than others. And something that really drives my work is that the problems that I'm most interested in solving are so core and widespread, yet we don't seem to have a lot of solutions around it. So what I mean by that is, let's look at kind of things like hiring. We know at this point, I can look at an early stage startup and predict all the hiring mistakes they're going to make. We've had enough examples, and a lot of you maybe who have run startups or worked at a startup, and we're going to mess up this VP hire, and it's going to take us 6 months to figure out something is wrong. It's going to take us another 6 months to transition them out, just things like that. And we have this, looking at hiring specifically, this gap between, we know it's a problem, we know that people are struggling with it, but also at the same time, people really know it's important. So the lack of solutions really tells me that there's a lot of opportunity for us to do a lot of education and talking about the problem instead of trying to maybe hack our way out of solutions or like automate ourselves out of the problem. So the things that I end up talking a lot about are patterns that I find from just one-on-ones, whether it's startups themselves saying we're struggling with this, how do we hire engineers, how do we hire this, to tech workers struggling with maybe a really toxic culture, especially folks from underrepresented backgrounds. What I try to do is figure out what's the common themes underlying these patterns. What do I think is happening at this multi-layer of the psychology of people and how things are structured. And by talking about them, I'm hoping we can actually find meaningful solutions instead of just hacks of what job board can I post on and throw my money at, and I'll magically end up with a diverse team. And I'm like, it's not actually how that works, because we actually need to look at Why does diversity matter? What does it mean to you? What are the existing systems that leads to, unless we're paying attention, very homogeneous teams? Why does that hurt your business in the long run? All these questions are really interconnected for me. So to connect some of those ideas and to bring people along with me, that's what I really use writing for.
Yeah, and that was actually something I was really curious to hear from you about is with your work, do you often find yourself trying to write, I guess when you're writing something, when you're even maybe doing consulting work with companies, do you find yourself trying to find the people who already care, but just need kind of some guidance on how to implement some directional things that they want to do? Or do you often find yourself having to convince people to care to begin with, and then they can start their journey? So I don't know, you can tell me if that makes sense, but I'm curious how you
Yeah,
think about.
no. It's a really great question because it's actually something I think a lot about. When it comes to, let's say, diversity, equity, and inclusion work, this work is really broad. It not only affects us as leaders and businesses and teams, but literally every aspect of society, institution. We could be talking about a lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So for me, I think we're going to need kind of like multifaceted solutions to a problem that doesn't really have a single definition or solution. So where I try to focus on is, look, I don't have time to convince people who don't want to be convinced. When it comes to diversity work, it's a very emotionally charged topic for very understandable reasons. We are the products of a society, of a culture that has a long history of oppression, of racism, sexism, ableism, homophobia. I can go through all the isms. For someone to decide to want to, wait, like this doesn't make sense. I want to do better for whatever sphere of influence that I have, whether it's my team or my company. I know that diversity leads to better outcomes. So those are the people that I'm most interested in working with. Sorry, that was a Freudian slip. Because for a lot of people, they're just not there at that point in their own personal journey. And where I found to be most effective is for those folks who, whether intuitively or through their experiences, know that diversity matters and it's important to them, but they're not yet equipped with maybe the language, the basic concepts that allows them to actually think about it more deeply. What are my next immediate steps? What should I be reading? So that you can lead to your own progress, whatever that looks like for you. So an example of this is that if you're someone who cares about diversity on an abstract level, but a lot of people don't actually know what language they're supposed to use. The fear of what if I say the wrong word and someone just like yells at me and then I'm accused of being, again, sexist, racist, whatever. So where I try to come in is tapping into that person's journey of curiosity. I want to learn, but I don't know how. The fear of speaking up and being wrong is so understandable. The curiosity, that's the best place to be learning from. That's really where I want to focus on. I also learn a lot from my peers, other teachers in this space who are doing really great work, who might be working on other aspects of this work. And I really think it is going to take a multifaceted approach because my messaging and the way the stages of the journey that I focus on is not enough. But I know where I can make the most impact, and that's where I spend most of my time.
Yeah, I love the framing of curiosity, meaning that there's potential. The person is directionally wants to go on the right journey. They just need some guidance and some help to start that, to take those next steps. And I love curiosity. It's just maybe the good intent that they have, but just frankly don't have the tools yet to do much.
Yeah.
This could be impossibly broad, but I am super curious to ask you, when you start to work with companies, when you're going to write pieces, do you find yourself repeating any common pieces of advice? In other words, I'm kind of curious, what are maybe the most common pieces of advice or new, I don't know if mental models is the word, but new ways of thinking that you most often find yourself introducing to founders and folks you work with?
I think that's why writing is so powerful, right? As a kind of a fundamentally at my core, lazy person, I don't enjoy answering the same question more than probably 2 or 3 times. So whenever I find myself doing that, tells me like, oh, this means I need to write a blog post, a tweet thread, and investing like an hour there means I will just save my future self so many more hours of repeating the same thing over and over again. So back to the original question, what are some, maybe I can give like an example of a common thread that I give. Because I work with early stage startups for whom they're actually in some ways the best position to work on diversity, because by the time you're Google, Facebook, and you're thousands of people strong, it's really hard to move the needle in numbers because it's representationally, you're going to have to hire hundreds and maybe thousands of people just to move the needle a couple percentage points. Whereas startups, when you're starting out from scratch, one hire can really make a big difference. And on the flip side of that, not prioritizing diversity early can lead to a lot of diversity debt. So a concept that I'll talk a lot about is the canary in the coal mine for startups. So a lot of startups, understandably, are caught up in survival. We are trying to figure out how to raise the next round of funding, meet these sales numbers. How can we possibly worry about diversity right now? It seems like a luxury. It seems like a faraway abstract problem. So I came up with this metaphor of canary in the coal mine, which is something that is used in real life and in mining work, which is incredibly dangerous work. What people used to do, maybe they still do, I should check on this, is that they'll actually take a bird down with them to the kind of deep levels to serve as like a warning system. Because these creatures that are a lot more sensitive to maybe toxic fumes, by paying attention to the health of the bird, whether when it stops singing or when it just drops dead, that tells you something is wrong. A similar thing happens with bias and diversity in small groups, which is that, let's say you and I started a startup and the 7 of us that are in this call are a startup, and we're eventually going to become pretty good friends because we spend a lot of time with each other. We're going to build trust. That's just like naturally what happens. So we don't need to rely so much on process, for example. But as we grow, a good problem to have is that we're hyper growth scaling. We're going to need to build out more and more processes and structure and policies to save ourselves from doing the one-on-one same conversation over and over again. The problem is that whenever small groups exist, biases exist, because again, we are just the product of everything that we've consumed, everything we've been told, and all the messages we've absorbed as we've been growing up. And while one-on-one, those biases may feel like they're not as relevant, you definitely start to see them come up. Biases get built in and baked into organizational structures, management policies, without even realizing it. An example of this might be if you're hiring and you're setting up homework assignments. And because you're a first-time founder, you don't really know what you're doing yet, you set up a homework assignment that's maybe like really takes a lot of hours, let's say 10 hours, 12 hours, not the worst I've heard. So that's going to affect people differently. In that maybe someone with caregiving responsibilities, maybe someone who is older, they just won't have the time to complete a test like this. So they end up dropping out of your process. And the people who are able to pass through the process are maybe some folks who are younger, people with certain privilege. So by the nature of this process you've set, you end up hiring a certain group of people when the goal is, how do we hire the best person for the job? Which may or may not have anything to do with how many hours that they happen to have available on their weekends and hours of 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. What you might not realize is that I guess just like young, let's say like white men are passing this test, they must be the best engineers. And you're just not even realizing who's falling out of this stage. What doesn't seem like a big problem when you're 10 people, 20 people, definitely becomes an issue when you are, let's say, 500. Because now it is the people with a lot of time and maybe privilege, they start to say like, well, I actually want to do this test. And the person that fell out of your funnel earlier, these people are often from marginalized backgrounds. They are the ones, whenever a system is biased against them, they're the first to feel its effects. We just as leaders often are just not used to thinking of them as like the first warning signal for, hey, this is something that you want to fix before your company gets any bigger. It becomes more entrenched into the system because it's a lot harder to change when you're 500. Like, try changing compensation policies, philosophies, when everyone's already used to one system when you're 5,000 people. So that's a concept that I've had to explain over and over again, including now. So I have just found that when it comes to meeting folks where they're at, trying to demystify some key concepts and do a little bit of walking down skepticism and something like, oh, diversity, I know it's important, but I don't know why it's important now. I just don't have time for it. By validating, yeah, like it is hard. Yes, it does kind of sometimes mean going against the grain, but here's how it helps you in the long run. And we're not even asking that you have to think about diversity 24/7 from now on. Still validating, you're still trying to do your job of managing all these different priorities. Just by even starting to think about it, you can get so much ahead, and here are all the benefits for you.
Yeah, I know you're not doing this as some sort of marketing ploy, but I love the framing as this is a very kind of practical concern in a sense, in that it doesn't come across as judgmental, or but people don't necessarily would not feel attacked by this sort of framing. It's very pragmatic in a sense, in that I, as the founder, want my company to be a great place to work long term. I don't want to preemptively rule out people who could be super helpful for our mission in 2 or 3 years. If I keep
Yeah.
optimizing for the same type of person, I love what you said. You're preemptively, you won't even know the candidates you're missing
Mhm.
because they're just not going to show up. They're going to drop out way earlier. So love the framing because it doesn't feel like a personal attack or whatever the defenses might be. So I think that's really brilliant. And a couple things before we go into
Yeah.
the writing part that I just wanted to ask is, you've been at this for a few years now and really worked with some of the best companies in Silicon Valley to help them think through a lot of these problems. I guess two-part question. One is, how have you seen maybe the culture change or not change in those preceding years? And then I'm also curious whether you're optimistic, pessimistic, cautious about the future of how people are thinking about building teams and being more inclusive.
Yeah. So first part, what's the change that I'm seeing? And then second, optimism versus pessimism. So I'll answer the second part first, because honestly, in one day, I can go through all the, like, everything's going to be amazing in the future. I really believe in it till everything's going to be terrible. And I think that's just the nature of progress. This kind of work means that we're never going to be done. And because we're always comparing ourselves to here's how it could be better, here's how we can imagine ourselves to be holding ourselves to a much higher standards, a little bit of idealism thrown in there, means that I think a really cautious optimism is what I strive for, which is optimism to make sure I and my community can keep going in this work, which can be very emotionally draining and very difficult, but cautious in that we're also being very practical about how we go about it. The first question, though, I actually have seen a ton of change in the last 3 or 5 years alone. I would say I had the weird privilege of starting diversity work before it became mainstream. For me and my last startup, my team at my last startup, was we started really prioritizing and figuring the diversity issue in 2014. And that was before most tech companies had it on their radar. I think that's where we really got to, without the kind of external pressure, but because we really believed in it, got to do a lot of experimentation, do a lot of internal consensus building, coalition building, making a lot of mistakes, which were different. They would be perceived differently now because of the emotional charge around this. So I think the last 5 or 6 years, we have really gone from not very much talked about, very much like a fringe, like what are they doing over there in the corner, to something that has, I don't know any company that's not having to talk about it, whether it's from a place of excitement or even some kind of like fear. But I think what I do see is that when it comes to diversity or even my hiring work, which is all about we need to treat people like humans. Oh my God, radical. Management should be better because the responsibility of management, the power responsibility management, when we can actually unlock it, like it just unlocks so much productivity. That's a side tangent. I think it's something that so many of us intuitively know to make sense. That really helps us. We need it. We want to do better about it. And the biggest difference I've seen is going from back of mind or not talking about it to curiosity. I would say the years of like 2017, 2018, with post-election energy, the post like Me Too. And this year in 2020 is where I really started seeing companies feeling a sense of urgency for the first time. So we went from curiosity to, wow, we actually have to prioritize this. And I think really was an effect of the pandemic in general and how different groups of people were affected by a global kind of disaster scenario like this. And obviously the Black Lives Matter protests following George Floyd's murder this summer, it really surfaced a lot of things that our systems and our culture allowed us at this up until this point to suppress, pretend it doesn't exist because it wasn't affecting a lot of our day-to-day. And all of a sudden it was. So the sense of urgency I'm seeing can be a little bit tricky because I personally find it a little bit hard to work with companies that I don't, who are in panic mode, panic reactionary. In those cases, that's where I really point them to my writing, which is, here's a way to educate yourselves. Please ask me any specific questions based on that. But that's not where I need to personally spend time one-on-one with them. And it's also, a way of protecting my energy and my time and my boundaries. So it's funny because I'm really grateful for the investment I made in myself in creating so much content in probably 2018, 2019. Because when this summer and my demand, I truly have never been more popular in my entire life until the summer. I was able to point folks to, you should read this blog post. Oh, that question I've previously answered in this exact format that you want, and listen to this podcast. So it's been a really effective way, accidentally, to scale myself and my message. Because now where I do want to focus and my one-on-one time on as a consultant, as an advisor, are the companies that have worked through the panic. So they're past that and they've calmed down. They're no longer in like DEFCON 1 mode internally where employees and leaders are yelling at each other. When the dust has settled, they're like, okay, we're finally ready to take responsibility for this. Our leaders are open. They're finally ready to approach the conversation and invest real-time resources because they now feel a new sense of not just like the urgency, but like a moral responsibility. I'm like, great, let's go. So the writing and the content has really allowed me to work with different people at different stages and get to choose where I get to spend my time.
God, I love that because it's almost like you get this, because if you hadn't done that, there'd almost be this binary world where I'll either work with you or I won't. And in a certain way, even though you may not be ready to work with some of these companies that really they're not ready to work with you, what a shame it would be if that was where the conversation ended, because maybe these blog posts can get their minds to change and take it more seriously. You get to start to embed your thinking in a lot of these companies. So I love your point. And this is a perfect transition into one of the 3 writing projects that I really want to talk about, because I think many people have a version of this that they're working through. And the first is you started the Inclusion at Work blog, which I think was a weekly kind of advice type format I think it was mostly published on Medium, but you can tell me. And I loved reading through those because it was just these very direct answers to questions that I've certainly had before. You gave very practical, direct advice and context. But I'm really curious how that project came about and if you'd like to maybe elaborate more on your intention with launching that blog.
Yeah, Inclusion at Work is the advice column that I mentioned. And it actually probably goes back to the roots. Actually, in college, I wrote for the campus newspaper. I was a career advice columnist. And I really loved doing that. Years later, my brain was like, you know what we should do again? That really came as a result of, once again, like receiving the same questions over and over, but also receiving questions that were very emotionally loaded. I don't mean that in a negative way, but for example, founders who are really finding themselves stressed out about something and not knowing where to go for help. They have their own kind of like fears and insecurities, to people from underrepresented groups, whether it's a Black female employee who's finding herself constantly getting pushed aside for promotions, opportunities, and not having anyone to talk to about it. So I found that the writing, kind of the advice column format, was really helpful because they can both talk about the problem, but also bring their, like, here's how I'm feeling, here's where I'm struggling. And writing that in responses to that, I got to really, imagine myself, if this person was in front of me saying these things to me, what would I say to make sure that I want to help them with their problem? But it's a lot of helping people feel seen, validating a lot of their, again, fears and anxieties, which everyone is feeling to a certain degree when it comes to this topic. And the thing that I try to do with advice column is that while we're trying to definitely serve that one individual person's concern and their situation and their context, I always try to pull out what's like the universal theme here, that even if you're not in that position or you're not in that demographic, you can relate to an aspect of their story. So my friend and I that started it, we really tried to address that together. The second part that I would say is that is a project that I started on my own, and I brought in a collaborator, a friend of mine, to do it together. And that's probably where I really learned just the power of collaboration in writing. Writing can be such a solo activity, but I just had so much fun actually like bouncing ideas off of each other, editing each other's work, learning from each other. So one thing that I wish I learned earlier was that like, if you ever find collaborators, cling onto them for dear life.
Yeah, this is something at the foundation of what we're trying to do with Compound, where we think that ideas are much better when they're constructed together in so much of work, right? We all have these blind spots or these gaps, if you will, that having another perspective can really unlock, and 1+1 can equal 3 instead of 2. So totally agree. I wish more people thought like that, because I think really maybe only one person can type at a time, but there can be a lot of contributors on constructing an idea together. So I love that discovery. The other, maybe just one final question on the advice column format. If someone, we have some folks in Compound who have done this. We have a few other guests who have done this format in different industries and different spaces. And I guess I'm curious for you, maybe you already had a bit of an audience at that point, but I'm curious how you went about finding your first few readers, getting your first few questions, just getting that format off the ground. Because I know there's folks who I think would be curious to explore this, but maybe don't have an existing kind of audience to launch it into.
Yeah, so I can only speak to what's really worked for me. At the end of the day, writing is such a personalized kind of stylistic thing that different things will work for different people. But where I really strive for is depth and emotional resonance. So for me, this is purely a personal thing, but I'd rather write fewer pieces that, really get to like the heart of the problem, help people feel like, oh, I've never seen anybody else talk about like this way before. I know for a lot of people, they found success in kind of the more, maybe the just like churning out different pieces of content. And I think that's also great because you can get a lot of magic within that. But I think for me, the topics that we try to talk about we would purposely pick out what's not being covered elsewhere. So as diversity, equity, inclusion, the topic was starting to gain momentum and popularity for the first time in a long time. We were looking at, okay, what are some now common traps that are easy to maybe fall into? So one post that we came up with that ended up doing really was covering this concept of obligation to DEI work. So when companies are saying like, oh, we should do this, this seems important, something that companies were doing at the time was identifying like your one woman engineer or like your one Black employee, be like, what do you think we should do? Which, even if in the good intent, what it actually does is put additional burden on the already marginalized person on their team. You're like looking at this person and be like, tell us the answer to solving this really big problem, a responsibility that is given to nobody else. So we ended up writing a piece called, Obligated to DEI, Diverse DNI, same thing, by the way. That was really about, so a friend of mine, a Black woman, wrote about her experience of sometimes her just existing and thriving in a startup is diversity work. If other people can see a Black woman in a technical role is doing well there, her doing well in her career, her getting promoted is diversity work. You don't have to necessarily take on, oh, now you're in charge of our recruiting. Oh, now you have to go spend all these extra hours teaching, consulting. If you yourself are doing well, and the company understands that this work is supposed to serve them, because by doing that, we're all benefiting, as opposed to, okay, now that we're doing diversity work, we're now going to give extra work to underrepresented groups. Do we see how that's actually not helping any of us? And we're actually perpetuating the systems of inequity that we're actually trying to solve. So that post ended up doing really well. We didn't do a whole lot of marketing. We just would share with a couple of diversity groups. And we were really surprised to see the word of mouth and the organic sharing that happened. The feedback that we got for weeks and months following was, I didn't know how to articulate this before. I have been feeling this exact struggle. And I think that's where really powerful writing comes in, when you help people feel less alone by articulating either a struggle or a feeling. That's what emotional resonance is. That's what that truth is that people are so hungry for. Another kind of quick parallel I can make is that I think a lot of the work that I do, especially on Twitter now, is talking about tech workers and burnout and toxicity, which may or may not have anything to do with diversity, the impact of bad management, these things that we feel like we're not allowed to talk about. But I actually think we absolutely should, because that's how we make things better. There's a lot of shame associated with these things, but I actually don't think it's an individual problem. I think it's a much more systemic one. And the more we can talk about it and be open about it, the better our chances for naming the problem and working on it. So that's what I really try to do in my writing. One of the best pieces of feedback that I got recently was someone left a comment, "I really like your post. It helps you confront reality with compassion." And I thought that was such a kind way of putting it. I didn't know that I was trying to do that, but I guess that's what it is.
God, beautifully said. Yeah, I loved it. The two things I got from you there were, the importance of emotional resonance, and really just going after the core of the thing that people will feel on a deep level. It's so true. If you can hit that nerve, that's the impulse that drives people to share ideas, to share your work, to spread the gospel, if you will. And I love this idea of what are maybe the things that no one's talking about, because in tech, it's all about hustle and working hard. And so no one's talking about burnout because maybe you don't want to be weak or vulnerable or whatever. And I love that. Screw it. Let's lean into that. Let's talk about the impact that's having, because almost certainly people are feeling that on a deep, almost visceral level. Love that advice. I think that certainly applies just to almost any sort of writing.
What's funny, I actually learn a lot from Gen Zers that I follow on Twitter for lists. I think like millennial and above, think of like the internet as like a place to present the best versions of ourselves, and like, here's all of my accomplishments, here's like my very highly curated Instagram feed. And I love the kind of like the Gen Z and upcoming generation, because like they're all about like, everything is terrible and everything sucks and I'm depressed. And there's just something really freeing about that. So I actually try to take some of that energy and, intersect it with some of the work that I do, whether it's in hiring, diversity, because like, as soon as I say it, people are like, yeah, I do feel that. I didn't know I was allowed to say it.
Oh my God, I love it. You're so right. The younger people, they just don't really care.
I
They've
love
been
it.
brought up on the internet. They can be themselves a little bit
Yep.
more. Totally. Yeah, I know. It's almost when I'm on TikTok, I always just love the raw honesty. They're recording a fight with their parents or something. It's just hilarious.
I know. Sometimes it'll be like, are they allowed to do this? And then I realize, of course they are. This because it helps people feel so much less alone.
Yes, totally. God, the kids are wiser than us. Sometimes I fear. They're way ahead of us. I love that note. I need to find some like funny younger people to liberate me from the LinkedIn culture that we've been raised in.
For sure.
I know we're going to come up in the last 15 minutes here. And for anybody on the call who has some questions, I will carve out the last few minutes where we can do a Q&A. So feel free if you've got something just to start thinking about it now. But the two other things I really did want to get in before we called it here was Holloway published this kind of guide on hiring. You contributed a large part of that. And I think you helped contribute to the whole guide, but you wrote the diversity inclusion chapter. I think it was 2 parts. And that was certainly a big undertaking, right? That was a really meaningful project. It covered, I think, a lot of foundational ideas. So I'm curious how that project came about. Maybe I'll start there. How did that project come about? And I'll be really curious to hear your experience actually doing the work.
Yeah, the Holloway team is great. They're all about trying to bring this a new way of writing and reading on the internet. So they really wanted to focus on different sections, and hiring was one of them. So when they approached me about, we really want to have a focus, a lens on diversity, equity, and inclusion, it was a project that I was super excited to collaborate with. What's funny is that the Holloway, their business model is that it's a paid guide. And I actually, as part of my negotiating to work with them, I insisted that they should consider making their diversity section free, because not only very practically it would be great lead gen for them, but also it's just something that everyone needs so badly. Once again, when it comes to doing a lot of teaching, raising awareness, I really saw this format and content, and on both sides, but both myself and the Holloway team, the amount of work that we were willing to invest in it, that we could really do a lot of good by making that available for free for folks. So that was a very substantial effort. Like it's a book, and then the chapter is like a mini book within itself. But we really wanted to focus on core definitions, key concepts, myth busting, like what are some common traps, and really make sure that for those folks who want to get started, want to educate themselves, but just don't even know where to start. Like, how can we create something that can really be like a start here, and from here you can go so many different directions. And I've gotten so much incredible feedback from folks saying like it's changed the way we think about diversity. We've done like book clubs at my startup on just this chapter alone. So I've been just so pleased by the incredible feedback that I've gotten.
That's profound. And one thing I'm curious about is just the effort to put that thing together. Was this the kind of compilation of the years of writing you had done before? Was this, you're starting with a blank slate? I'm curious because I know there's at least one person we were chatting with earlier on the call planning to undertake a longer form, really book-like project.
Yeah.
Just curious how you went about actually like deciding how the hell am I going to go about crafting this kind of big project?
I think it was both, honestly, in that a lot of the ideas that I've been talking about and writing about for a long time kind of came together. But we also did start with kind of a blank slate, in that writing is like a mini book, like you really can do anything. And the number one kind of like lesson I learned in that was the value of working with actually a professional editor. It was my first time working with the folks who are so good at it. I didn't know this was a thing, like truly world-class editors at the Holloway team. Because what they were able to do is I could just dump out my raw thoughts. And I really felt like I was like, any of this makes sense, just like vomit it out. And they were so good at like pulling out structure. So that's really where I learned the power of really great editing. And once again, it comes back to collaboration. But I just learned that a professional, someone who's really good, if you're willing to invest, you have the right connections in that, might be a really interesting conversation to have, because whatever's in your brain that you're an expert on, that you have a lot of thoughts about, can be by yourself hard to kind of pull out and put structure. But that's what a really great editor can do for you.
God, I love that. Yeah, and it really, on some level, harkens back to that point about collaborative writing, where you can find like the yin and the yang between creation and refinement. So I love that. I know we're coming down to the last few minutes and we've got at least one question that I definitely want to get to. But the final thing, the final place where I notice you're very active, where you're really willing to share a lot of your thinking very openly, is obviously on Twitter, which I think is where a lot of people are willing to really give the more direct micro thoughts, if you will, as they come. And I'm just really curious to think about how you've thought about using Twitter as a lever for a lot of the work you do, as a way to get your ideas out in the world. And I'll start there, but I have a few follow-up questions. But yeah, tell us your secrets to using Twitter effectively.
Honestly, my Twitter career has been like accidental, but it's been so fun. And I'm so passionate about sharing all my secrets and everything that I learned. The origin of that story is that when I left my startup, I was quite burnt out. I was at a point in my career where I was feeling really low in terms of both self-esteem and mental and physical health were kind of like a disaster. And Twitter kind of came about. I know I did really good work. I know I have a lot that I want to share. I'm just going to start doing this as practice. So it actually started at a point where I was like incredibly burnt out. I had a really bad writer's block. So I've written like blog posts and essays my entire life, but I was at a point where I just couldn't. So I started tweeting, which was have one thought that fits into 280 characters, and it doesn't matter because you can just post it. And if you don't like it later, delete it. I think the perspective that really helps me is that you can choose to see a low follower count as the freedom to explore. No one cares what you're posting, and that's a good thing, because that means you can post anything and get real-time feedback. Whereas I'm actually at a point now, so for context, I started only tweeting in earnest less than 2 years ago. I had less than 1,000 followers, and in about 2 years, I've grown to about 18,000. And now it's a little harder because I can't really post half-hearted kind of just like impulsively, because I'll be like, now it's getting misunderstood. Like now it's reaching a crowd that's not necessarily meant for it, as opposed to like my immediate circle. But I actually remember having a lot of fun and being really nervous, honestly, when I just first started it. And I think a lot of folks who want to get better at Twitter, who are starting out, get really intimidated by folks who've been doing it for a long time, who have really large followings. You might get there at some point, you might not. That's fine. You can't compare yourself to someone who's been doing it for years and years. So what you have right now is you have 300 followers, of like 20 followers, doesn't matter. Just learn for yourself. Just try out what works, what doesn't. You can delete liberally. And then the last thing that really helped me when I first started out was I had all these friends, I had all these people that I was kind of like admiring from afar. And I got to be friends with some of them. I got to hire some of them. One of them is Marco Rogers, who's an engineering leader. And I actually got to help hire him into my last startup. And I was like such a fangirl. I was like, I can't believe I work with Marco Rogers. This is so amazing. He's so smart. He's been saying amazing, such cool things for many years. And I actually asked him, like, how do you do it? And he just was casually like, it's a lot of work, it takes a lot of practice. And when he said that, something really opened up for me, because it was so easy for me to assume like he must be naturally good at this. He must have been born a great tweeter. And maybe some people truly are. I don't know any of them personally. But when someone who I admire from far for so long gave me permission to be like, oh yeah, it was really hard, and I actually spent a lot of time practicing and learning it, it gave me permission to do it, to be bad at it when I started. And I think, yeah, that practice has made things so much easier.
God, and talk about it's like the comment you made earlier about Gen Z, and maybe our generation or whatever is a little bit more constrained and tries to show our best selves on the internet. There's something similar true of seeing someone's end destination and not realizing the process behind getting a big audience, having a great engaged readership. And there's actually, I remember James Clear finding his first tweet. It's still on his account. It's 13 likes. It's a link to a blog post, no retweets.
Yeah.
And obviously now he has almost 400,000. So I love that idea of everyone's on this journey, and don't let that stop you from getting started.
So I have this personal, I'll just quickly insert
Please,
this. I have this personal theory that I think anyone can be a great writer. I think you just have to get through a lot of crap first, like just produce a lot of words. And for some of us, maybe that's like 100,000. Maybe for some of us, it's 2 million. I don't know. But the act of creating allows you to learn so much from it. And when people tell me really humbling feedback, and you're like, oh, I really love your Twitter, it really resonates with me, I look forward to your tweets every day, I'm really appreciative of it. And I'm also thinking in the back of my mind, they're like, how do you do it? Honestly, as a kid, I moved around a lot, and I grew up on the internet. I consider myself like home on the internet. So in middle school, instead of having outside real life friends, I actually, my best friends were on the internet. So the difference, I think, is I just went through a lot of writing and iterating and reading early in childhood. So that puts me a little bit ahead a lot of folks. And my joke is that, oh, I'm just still posting like I talk. I write like how I talk. I still write and tweet with the filter of an angsty middle schooler, because that's how I learned to first do it.
I love this idea of, I've heard this quote, quantity has a quality of its own, where it's, you just have to get through this kind of barrier, and every time you create something, you learn a little bit, and it's messy and it takes a while, but I love it because it's very encouraging to keep going, because it can be very tempting to quit sometimes when it's not, why do I not have 1 million followers yet?
And I think that's why Twitter is so great, because you do get that real-time feedback for bite-sized pieces of writing that you can do. You'll find that, let's say if you just post 10 tweets, one of them maybe has 5 likes, and one of, most have like none. Okay, what is it about that one that has 5 likes, which might not seem alike, but you're already give yourself this experimentation of, what do you think it was about this tweet? Was it funny? Was it clever? Was it teaching something? Was it entertaining? Like, it could be so many different things. And then from there, you'll find your own style.
I love that 100%. Yeah, it's very rare in that sense. Not writing a big blog post doesn't always give you that luxury, and it's a big investment of time. Okay, just so I know we'll get to it, I do want to go into Q&A. The time flew by way too fast, and I want to start with Kyla's question here, which I love. Do you think how Gen Z operates will change how corporations operate in the future?
Absolutely. I think it's actually inevitable, and companies that realize this now and start moving towards it and really getting their shit together are going to find themselves at a huge advantage. So there's a lot of studies that are being done about values, what people are looking for. The millennial generation really posed as like the first shift, and then Gen Z just like reinforcing that even more. But in surveys of workers, we're finding that more and more young people, they're looking for a values fit. They're looking for a sense of belonging in a way that's just so different from, let's like older generations, our parents' generations, where we were told we should be grateful just to be employed. And I think a lot of factors have led to that change, but it really is a huge part of that is the internet. We have empowered people to create, to support themselves, to share, to connect in ways that were literally just like unfathomable to people even just a couple decades ago. And with that means people have higher expectations. People have higher standards for anything that they do because they know what the possibilities are in a way that we just had no idea when traditional media didn't allow for this kind of sharing and openness. So to that, I think when Gen Z, it's literally some of my favorite content is like following Gen Zers on Twitter because they'll just say like, the way my company do this is really weird. And then it makes me think about that is really weird. Why do I accept that as like a normal thing, whether it's like PR efforts or like management? That humans have a really good like a bullshit detector. And I think it's adults who have learned to suppress it in some ways because we're trying to fit in. We have mortgages to keep up with and so on. And it really is from the mouth of babes, the truth telling that points us to how there's something important here. There's something that we have forgotten that is possible.
God, beautifully said. I know that is. We need your approved list of Gen Zers to follow because
I think I might be able to create a list. Yeah.
yeah, I'm now realizing my Twitter needs a refresh. Awesome.
Less
So
VCs, more Gen Z is my
there's
Twitter
the
following
tagline.
strategy.
Yeah. Wow, that's brilliant. Have you tweeted that yet? Because that should be the 2021 tagline.
I think I said one time, make unfollowing VCs a trend.
Yeah. You want exponential growth in the other direction.
Oh gosh.
Okay, question from Nate. We've got 3 minutes on the clock here. How do you balance the time you spend reading and consuming and writing? Do you have any bumper lanes set up to catch yourself from skewing in the gutter too often?
Mm-hmm.
Great question.
Who doesn't at this point when the world's best content is truly available at your fingertips? Like all you have to do is open up TikTok and you just see so much high quality entertainment, the best tweets. So for me, something that I really am becoming very strict about, it's been harder during quarantine, but it's like really limiting screen time and phone usage. Actually, most of the time when I open Twitter, I try really hard to not look at my main feed. I look at my own feed and my own mentions and like conversations that I started, hopefully not from a self-absorbed place, but because I'm trying to protect my own attention and boundaries. If we're not careful, I do think it's so easy, something like Nate mentioned, like just get caught up in the volume, this tidal wave, infinite amount of content. And I really believe that to produce something meaningful, to create content that's meaningful, it's so important to stay aligned and connected with your own values and your own message. Information diet, screen diet is really important. Another thing that's tangentially related, but it actually really helps me, is thinking about your attention as a most precious resource. When besides like health and general survival, like assuming some basic level of comfort, your attention, where you choose to spend your time on that is probably the most important thing you can be doing. So to that's why I'm very pro like unfollowing people whose content does not make you think, whose content does not seem to, if it just takes up space, you don't owe them anything. Your attention is so valuable. And I connect that to my audience's attention. Every time someone follows me, that is they're giving me something. They're subscribing to my brain, which is such a crazy thought. They're giving me their most valuable resource. So to that, I try to take it really seriously. There's a balance of self-expression and doing it for fun, but I also really try to keep in mind for myself. First of all, I cannot believe like literally thousands of people have subscribed to my brain. I really want to serve them really well for it because that is, I'm sorry for getting a little too insincere, but it's like an honor I take really seriously. And because they came probably for the main reasons that we talked about, I want to help them do more of it without, of course, pandering to them because that's how you completely lose yourself.
God, beautifully said. Yeah, I love the idea of just really treating that as a almost a sacred relationship that they've given you this opportunity that you have, and almost this level of trust that you can either utilize or abuse and lose the relationship. So I love how you think about that gift of attention. And good God, I think we could all stand to hear that lesson one or two more times. We are right at the end of the hour. So Jennifer, what is the best, maybe this is obvious given our last conversation, but what's the best place for, where is the best place for folks to find you and follow along with your work?
Yeah, no, Twitter definitely is the best place for me. It's kind of the main central switchboard for everything I link out to. But it's also been a huge source of community and connection for me. I'm always happy to. Sometimes my DM inbox can get a little bit unwieldy, but I really try to be as responsive as possible.
Amazing. Jennifer, I just want to thank you for your time, all the hard-won wisdom, the great Twitter advice that I will definitely be doing my best to take. And I just want to thank everyone else for joining us live. I will get the recording live in the next day or two. We'll send it out to everybody. But Jennifer, I just can't thank you enough for carving out the time for us today.
Yeah, this was really fun. This is a topic that I'm truly like so passionate about. So thank you for hosting and inviting me.
Absolutely. Cool. Until next time, we will see you on Twitter.
All right.
Awesome.
Thank you all.
Great. See everybody.